Welcome everybody to the third plenary lecture of the 47th edition of the EARIE conference. I am Luca Lambertini, chairing the local organizing committee. And today I have the pleasure and honor of chairing the plenary talk by John Asker. Before introducing the figure of our most welcome guest, I would like to thank a number of people that have helped in a substantial way the realization of this conference, starting from John Vickers and Leslie Marks, and then Massimo Motta, Ina Cannell, the ExCom, the Scientific Committee, our sponsors, in particular, the global sponsors, RBB Economics, for a very generous financial support, as well as Meneghini and Associates, and our Chief Administrative Officer, Paolo Mandelli, at the Dipartimento of Economics of the University of Bologna. Without their patience, their efforts, and their comprehension, and their ideas of them all, this event would not have been possible. Now, I would like to spend a few words to introduce the figure of our guest, our plenary speaker, Professor John Asker. I'm an Alchian Professor of Economics at the University of California, Los Angeles, and previously Professor of Economics at Columbia University. John is currently co-editor of the American Economic Journal, Microeconomics, and has also served as editor of the Rand Journal of Economics, and before that, of the Journal of Industrial Economics. And his publication record includes several striking papers in many directions in many areas of IO, from advertising to auctions, from entry to vertical relations and cartel behavior. And indeed, his lecture today will focus on cartels and welfare. John, the floor is yours. Thank you very much again for accepting our invitation and for being here with us today. I will keep an eye on questions in the Q&A box. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying, as I try to work out how to share my screen, how grateful I am for the financial support given by the global sponsor RBB Economics. You know, these conferences rely heavily on the generosity of all the sponsors, and you know, that's something I'm sure all of us appreciate. Also, let me say, you know, as a speaker and participant, how much I've appreciated the work of Luca and the rest of the local organizing committee in putting all of this together. I have some experience with putting together conferences, and in particular the disruption that has been imposed on all of us in the last six months or so. And so having to organize this conference twice is something that I certainly am deeply appreciative of. So thank you very much. And also thank you for the opportunity to talk about a topic close to my heart, which is cartels and the impact that they have on us. I should say that much of what I will talk about today is joint work with Alan Collard-Wexler, who's at Duke, and Jan de Luca, who's at Leuven in Belgium. So the agenda today is to talk about recent work that we've done thinking about what the welfare impact of cartels are. And this is cartels somewhat narrowly, but also speaks into a broader question of more generally, what's the welfare impact of market power? You know, the approach we're going to take is a very dual approach, which is to say, using theory really quite intensively to inform our understanding of data. There's going to be a component of this which is just plotting through the basic framework for doing so, and then with a significant ongoing application across a series of papers, where that application will be the global oil market in which OPEC is a central cartel player. So it's always fun to explain to IO people why they should care about cartels. For most of us, it's obvious, but it's actually worth thinking about this for a second. There's some methodological reasons, I think, why it's useful to think slowly and carefully about welfare economics as they apply. The data and models we use obscure welfare objects of interest a lot of the time. Now, what this means as a practical matter is that we rarely measure deadweight loss together with productive inefficiency within the same setting. And one might well ask, which one matters more? This has some implications for how we think about where the core harms from market power and in particular cartelization occur, and also what we might do to mitigate it. The second thing we're going to do here is to look at a truly massive market. Oil is it's almost trite to say that it's geopolitically important. So many of the metrics we're going to be moving around in this measurement exercise are going to be measured in trillions of US dollars. Part of the reason for focusing on a market like this is to push back against a view that it is mildly pervasive in the rest of economics, which was captured by Al Harburger in 1954 when he said that by and large, when we're interested in the big picture of our economy, we need not apologize for treating it as competitive. In other words, we can ignore everything that IO economists think is interesting. For the last 10 years, I've been significantly motivated by this observation, in the sense of trying to work out the extent to which it might be true. And let me say my view is that it's not. And coming up with empirical demonstrations for the impact that cartels have at a fairly aggregate level. It's also worth noting that as late as 2006, when Mike Winston was putting together his lectures on antitrust, which is a great little book, with respect to price fixing, he said it's surprising how limited the published literature is in documenting significant effects of price fixing. It's worth putting the emphasis there on published literature. Many of us, if not all of us, follow what happens in practice with competition authorities and so on. And if you follow what they do, then it's clear that many cartels have a significant effect. Since Mike wrote that, we've seen a number of really interesting contributions that speak to the broader impact of cartels and market power. And let me just, give some references to a few, and we contribute to that body of work. There's two in particular I want to point out. Work by John Connor, who does an excellent job in just aggregating what we know about cartels. In a series of papers, most recently in 2009, I think, he aggregates what we know and sort of points out that the average overcharge for a cartel is in the order of 30%. Somewhat more recently, Kawai and Nakabayashi examined cartel behavior in the Japanese market for public procurement, in particular construction projects. And their conclusion was that the price impact of cartel activity there amounted to just a tiny bit less than 1% of tax revenues, which is to say the government was paying too much for the construction projects due to cartel behavior, and that too much amounted to 1% of tax revenue. It's an extraordinary number, especially in a developed country with an active enforcement agency. So, with that backdrop, let me talk about what we're going to do. What I'm going to do to begin with is really just talk about simple theory that is going to give structure to how we think about data. So I want to begin with a very, very simple model. So if we think about a market in which there's a set of dominant firms, say a cartel, I might occasionally just say a dominant firm, but I want you to hear that as a cartel. All of these firms have a constant marginal cost with some aggregate group capacity constraint equal to, if you look at the slide, I'll denote that with Q superscript C subscript 1. So there's this group of large firms with a constant marginal cost that's fairly low. And there's also going to be a fringe of firms that are price takers that have, say, an upward sloping supply curve, which sits above the marginal cost of this dominant group. Okay, and all firms are going to sell the same product, and there's no differentiation. So you can already see this is somewhat geared towards thinking about oil production as an example, but I think the insights are somewhat more general. So visually, this is what we're talking about. Downward sloping demand. You can see the marginal cost of the dominant group. The black dot indicates their aggregate capacity constraint. And then the fringe comes in and provides the rest, where the marginal producer is a member of that fringe, and price C for competition to PM for PM for monopoly. Okay. So what are the welfare impacts of this? Well, first, classically, what we would do is just to think about the price impact or overcharge, and that's indicated on this graph. Somewhat more rarely, we would do the classical price theory exercise of working out all of the welfare triangles, and let me just walk you through that next. So what I'm showing you here is the deadweight loss, which is to say the loss gains from trade that occur by virtue of underproduction in this market. Okay, so this features prominently in all of the undergraduate textbooks from which we teach. And something I want you to note is that this arises even in models and frameworks where we have no heterogeneity on the cost side. Now, the other part of this, which is important, is what I'm going to call productive inefficiency, which is to say, even for that amount of quantity that is produced, some of it is being produced by producers that have too high a cost. So that is to say that the resource cost of production is higher than it should be. Now, there's various ways you can say this. It would be equivalent to say that productivity in the quantity sense has decreased in this industry by virtue of the imposition of cartelization. If you were further into the productivity literature, you would say that TFPQ has been reduced. Or if you're just a straight down the line person who teaches price theory to your undergraduates, you would just say that there's productive inefficiency in the sense that goods that are being produced, at least some of them are being produced at too high a cost. So together, what we have is a total welfare impact that's the sum of the deadweight loss and the productive inefficiency. What I want to do now is to think about the extent to which these two objects usually turn up in the theoretical frameworks we often have in our heads, and in particular in the empirical work that's done in industrial organization. And I think it's fair to say that both theory and empirical work often abstract away from this full consideration of the impact of cartelization. Both for natural reasons, and I'm guilty of this in my own work. Theory is often concerned with other issues. And so imposing an assumption like common marginal costs across all firms is a natural and appropriate thing to do. But that comes at the cost of ex ante ruling out the kind of productive inefficiency that I've just highlighted. If all the firms have the same cost of doing stuff, it's impossible for a welfare cost due to productive inefficiency or the misallocation of production to occur. Empirically, I think it's fair to say this sin is committed more often. And I think it really has a lot to do with data limitations. So, think about the demands you put on data if you want to appropriately measure all of the objects that I put in front of you. You need to know about the demand curve. You need to know also about the full shape of the supply curve. And typically in the kind of empirical work that you see a lot in industrial organization, particularly on the structural side, you either have good demand data or good cost data, rarely both. And to the extent that you have informative variation, it's around the equilibrium point rather than variation that lets you see quite a lot about the shape of this thing. So often, for instance, what you might do in empirical work is have price and quantity data with which you estimate a demand curve. You would use a conduct assumption to back out marginal cost, and you would make the assumption that marginal cost is constant across firms or something like that. Let me just stop there and ask if there are any questions.
Not at the moment, John.
Excellent.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Very good. So, similarly, there's a body of really very interesting work in industrial organization that tries to come at things from the cost side, and this is typically where we're estimating something about productivity. And there you have the flip of the situation I talked about, where you can pull out you can pull out the something about the cost curve or its dual, the production function, but you get relatively little insight into the demand conditions. So ideally, to really understand what cartels are doing, we have a intensive data environment that we need to deal with, which we typically don't enjoy. Let me back up at this point and say that these sort of traditional price theoretic measures of impact are not the only things you might be interested in. And I want to give a brief reference to work that's being done in the health space, particularly in less developed countries, where we're starting to see papers where people are looking at cartels that have occurred in some countries, particularly in health, and measuring their impact, not so much in the objects that I'm talking about here, but rather in just their human cost, which is to say, an example is a great paper that's in the working paper stage by Aaron Barkley at the University of Melbourne, who looks at the Mexican cartel that operated in insulin a little while ago. These guys controlled the price of insulin. When the cartel collapsed, the price of insulin went down 80%. And by Aaron's calculations, the cartel, when it was operating, generated just under 650 deaths a year from the under-provision of insulin. It's hard to think of a more human cost than the cost imposed on the Mexican population by that cartel. Nonetheless, for better or worse, I'm going to focus on the price theoretic stuff. And now what I want to do is to just talk through some more about this particular framework, but focus much more on measurement and think about what this as a theoretical structure tells us about the kind of things we need to understand to measure these theoretical objects. So, here's the welfare setup again. What I'm going to do is to just simplify the picture and get rid of a lot of the notation. But before I do that, I'll just remind us what the necessary objects are that we need to be thinking about. What we're going to need is a demand curve, a cost curve, and also to measure these welfare impacts, I need to understand what the counterfactual supply curve would look like. And in particular, what that means in this instance is that I need to understand what a social planner would do, or in other words, what a competitive equilibrium would do. Because in my data, what I'm going to see is a market that's contaminated by the distortions imposed by a cartel, okay? So let's unpack each of those. So for the demand curve, what I need is price and quantity variation. And I need, instruments that allow me to appropriately estimate demand. Now, more than that, what I need is significant variation in the data, in the sense that what I want to do is to be able to see demand over a fairly wide region, okay? Otherwise, I would worry that I'm extrapolating outside the scope of my data. Now, similarly, on the cost side, I need to understand marginal costs, both around the equilibrium points, but also inframarginally, right? I need to have a view on what marginal cost looks like for inframarginal units of production. So that's going to be pretty hard. And the route that I'm going to take on this is to just use cost data, which is something economists are probably correctly generally leery of, but it's a necessary evil. And theory is actually going to be quite helpful in telling me how to interpret the data I do have. And lastly, I need a model to tell me what the world would look like in the event that the market was competitive rather than cartelized.
John?
Yes.
May I jump in? There's a question, which is the following. Thinking about the specific case of oil production, this kind of misallocation, it refers to the previous slides, of course, has also spurred considerable exploration and R&D, especially in fracking. It's possible that these dynamic incentives have a significant welfare impact as well. Say, if new entrants incentives were below the social benefit. Hard to know how to measure the extent of this.
Yes, I totally agree with that last statement. And I also agree that the effect is real. And I'll show you that in data in about 10 to 15 minutes.
Right.
That extensive margin of entry is something that I haven't baked into this simple setup. It's fascinating, and thank God there's more directions for future research. Give me just a second, and I'll show you exactly what that fracking stuff looks like. It's marked and important. I have one more conceptual thing I want to talk about, which is, I suspect, important in many applications, and it's definitely important in the context of oil, which is that the OPEC cartel is not the only distortion that hits this market. This is a market that's has a lot of taxes in very different ways imposed on it by different countries. There's political distortions for sure. Arguably, other players other than OPEC have market power. To get a sense of that, think about the agreements between Russia and OPEC in the last year or so over production, and also effectively the price war that they had in the early part of this year, somewhat unfortunately, at least for the US oil producing communities. There's other things going on. So to understand the impact of OPEC, you have to accept that you're working in an environment where there's definitely other distortions. And so this leads us into thinking about how to do measurement in a second best world, right? In the Lipsy-Lancaster sense. Now, once you sort of accept the nightmare that there's other distortions going on, that raises the question of how to do the welfare accounting. And what I'm going to show you is two different approaches. One is what I'm going to call the marginal approach, where the thought experiment is, given all other distortions, what's the marginal impact of market power, right? So given that there's a series of taxes in the market, what's the incremental impact of market power? Alternatively, one might ask, is absent all the other distortions, what's the impact of market power? And that's also an equally valid way of framing the question. The problem is that as we know, distortions don't just additively stack, but they interact. And so to do the decomposition, you've got to make a stand one way or the other on which of these two approaches you're taking. In this instance, it turns out to be very interesting to compare the two. So diagrammatically, what this amounts to is that if this is the market where there's only one distortion, that from cartelization, let me simplify it a bit, and then we start to worry that there's actually other distortions, in this instance just affecting the fringe, to measure the impact of market power, where we say, absent other distortions, what's the impact? That is to say, the inframarginal approach. What we want to do is to take all of the distortions out of the fringe and then see what happens. Use that as our reference point, right? So what would the world look like with cartelization, but without other distortions? And then compare that to a fully competitive market, right? And here you can see how that changes the shape and nature of the welfare objects of interest. By contrast, if we were to take the marginal approach, which is to say, what does the world look like? What do these welfare objects look like if we take all other distortions as given and then just put cartelization on top of it? It looks very different. So the thought experiment here would be to bake all of the distortions into our counterfactual competitive world and compare that to the world we actually see, which has all of those distortions and the cartel on top of it. And you can see that in this particular example, it has these two approaches have different measurement implications for productive inefficiency and deadweight loss. And that's not unexpected, but it's going to be interesting to compare the two approaches. So let me go from this sort of broad view to now talking about specifics. As I said, what I've been talking through is a pretty general approach. We're going to apply it to a large market that's going to be oil and OPEC from 1970 to 2014. This application is helpful and complicated in different ways. First, it's of independent interest. It's a big and globally important market that definitely has effects. Helpfully, it's at least plausibly homogeneous product. Unhelpfully, it's complicated by dynamics of the form that oil today can either be consumed today or it can be left in the ground and consumed tomorrow. And what that means is that, the distortions, say, from withholding production is not like in a normal widget market we would teach, where the production simply doesn't occur, but rather the distortion is one of intertemporal substitution. What we don't produce today, we produce tomorrow. And so the nature of the distortions are going to be governed by how much we care about that intertemporal substitution. So working out all of those dynamics is sort of sitting in the back of everything I'm going to talk about going from now on. I'm going to downplay it just a little bit, but it massively affects how you do the mechanical economics that underpins the kind of accounting that I'm going to do. Let me say that this work is drawn from 2 papers. One, which we published last year in the American Economic Review. That paper focuses specifically on productive inefficiency and engages, at least in part, with not just the IO literature, but also a largely macro literature on misallocation. A second paper, which is in production, does the full Monty in some sense, and measures both the deadweight loss and the productive inefficiency and puts it together in a fuller equilibrium setup. So it's largely that one that I'm going to talk about. So let me briefly remind you of who OPEC is. OPEC is a group of countries who are, the significant ones are around the Persian Gulf, although there's a bunch of other people around the place. It is unambiguously an imperfect cartel. Its history, like many actual cartels, is one of disagreement, general unpleasantness, occasional effective cooperation, and experimentation as to cooperative form. Nonetheless, it especially at times has had a massive impact on world production. And much of their power comes from the fact that, they have about 50% of world oil reserves and a rate of extraction that's about half as fast as the rest of the world. And a significant proportion of their reserves are incredibly cheap to suck out of the ground. Just to give some context, the 3 biggest producers of oil in the period that I'm going to look at, 1970 to 2014, Saudi Arabia, US, and Russia. More recently, China has also become a massive producer. OPEC helpfully self-identifies as a cartel. And so, their objective is to coordinate and unify petroleum policies across members in order to secure fair and stable prices for petroleum producers, an efficient economic and regular supply of petroleum to consuming nations, and a fair return on capital. So, that is anodyne until you think about it, and it's a fairly standard description of a cartel if you've looked at cartels that are able to operate without the shadow of enforcement around them. So it's certainly helpful that I don't have to convince anyone that they're a cartel. So that's OPEC. Now let me talk about the data a little bit. So the key part of the data we're going to use is very rich data from a Norwegian consulting firm that basically their business model is to collect as much data as they possibly can on the supply side of the market at the field level. So a field would be, a subset of the North Sea oil fields in the UK. It might be a couple of 100 square miles in Saudi Arabia. If you're familiar with the area around Los Angeles, there's some oil rigs off Santa Barbara. They would be a field on their own. So what these guys do is they collect enormously detailed data on production costs, production levels and reserves for all of the fields in the world. And they have an impressive data set on about 98% of all fields that exist, with data on production costs, reserves, technology and location. And this is data that's used widely in the industry and by industry investors, and also you often see it referred to in the IMF reports on oil and the macroeconomy and so on. Now here's the bit where I'm going to be slightly responsive to that question about fracking. What these graphs in front of you show is two things. So focusing on the one on the left, there's a black line. That's the oil price in constant 2014 dollars from 1970 to 2014. So we can see it go up during the oil crisis in the 80s, comes down through the 90s, and then goes up again through the 2000s, a blip down due to the 2008 financial meltdown, and then pops up again. Now you'll see that there are some black and grey bars. What those are is an indication of the distribution of costs of production in each year. So what we're doing here is taking, for each field, their production, dividing it by total cost. And first, the black bar is the interval from the 5th to 95th percentile in the cost distribution across fields on the left-hand side outside OPEC. You'll see that there's kind of a white line in the middle of that black bar. That's the cost of the median barrel outside OPEC. And then the grey covers 1% to 99% percentiles in the cost distribution by barrel. So what you can see is, if you compare non-OPEC to OPEC, is that OPEC has much lower costs, and in particular, it doesn't have the very high costs that we see in some productive units outside OPEC. And particularly after 2002, you know, the run up in costs at the 95th to 99th percentile is essentially all due to fracking. Those are the frackers. You know, since about 2002, though, fracking has been the marginal producer in this market. When I say fracking, I also mean Canadian oil sands and a few other things around the world. So unambiguously, I agree with the statement that high oil prices have definitely encouraged those folks to enter, you know, as they should. You know, that's what a fringe should do, and we should be seeing the least efficient people coming in when the price is high. You know, it's also true that the costs of fracking have gone down as they've worked it out, but it's still the case that some of the costs are still extraordinarily high. The entry of fracking is a big deal in terms of understanding industry equilibrium. At least when I look at these graphs, I hesitate to think that in terms of what's producing inframarginal rents, fracking is the primary thing, but rather it's the fact that, you know, many producers out there, both in and outside OPEC, have significantly lower costs than the world oil price. But you know, fracking is fascinating, and the entry is super interesting. In particular, once we get good data on what's happened in the last year or so, seeing the destruction of fracking in the US and other places due to the interaction between OPEC and Russia and others is also going to be something that warrants careful study. Let me stop there and ask if there are any questions.
No, at the moment not.
All right, thank you very much.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so let me briefly talk about the modeling issues here and then go to results. There's two things at a very high level that you need a model for to bring order to the chaos of these data. The first is to define a production function that guides you on how to interpret the cost data that I'm going to leverage to get the supply side. And the second is, you know, a model that helps me organize the dynamics, right? Because as I said before, you know, oil is this finite resource, and so I need to, you know, be able to fold that into a coherent story of what a social planner would do, which will inform me as to, you know, what a competitive market would look like. And also I need a coherent model to tell me what the welfare objects of interest look like, because, you know, they live inside a model, they're theoretical objects. So I'm going to go somewhat fast through this just to give you a sense of how we're doing it, and save you a lot of headaches from notation. We're going to do this by making assumptions. We're going to assume that oil is homogeneous, which to a rough first approximation isn't the worst assumption we're making. We're going to assume that there's a common discount factor. We're going to begin with a Leontief production function, which will give us constant marginal costs. And then we need some disturbances on those costs, which are going to be given to us by a martingale assumption on those disturbances. Now, the useful thing about all of this is that the implication is that in an efficient market, which is to say a competitive one, this means that there's a kind of a sorting algorithm that tells you the order in which fields should be extracted. Okay, so perhaps unsurprisingly, even in the dynamic setup with these assumptions, you should see lowest cost fields getting extracted first, right? And having a theorem that gives us that result massively eases the computation burden of computing a dynamic competitive equilibrium in this setting, okay? So, you know, that's the cost stuff. I should say that the Leontief production function helps enormously in the interpretation of the accounting data as well. It basically means you add it together and you have total cost in the sense that an economist would say total cost. So next, let me talk about the dynamics part of this. You know, let me reiterate that the central issue is that oil not used today can be used in the future. You know, the implications for a model are that hoteling rents need to be accommodated, right? You know, that is to say, an operator will be taking into account the opportunity cost of producing today, in, you know, given that part of that opportunity cost is that they're giving up rents tomorrow. All of this has implications for the welfare objects I talked about. With respect to productive inefficiency, right? So when a cheap barrel isn't extracted today, most likely it's going to be extracted in some relatively near-term year. So if it's not produced today, it'll be produced tomorrow. With deadweight loss, however, a barrel that's not contributing to consumer surplus today, effectively, when it does get produced, it just pushes out the entire path of consumption. So the incremental increase in consumption or change in consumption is right at the end of the production path. So the intertemporal substitution across these objects operate in very different ways. What this means is that the impact of the dynamics on productive inefficiency is much greater than it is on deadweight loss calculations. That may be a bit abstract, but it gives you some sense of the kind of the way when thinking through welfare in this dynamic setting, you've got to strap yourself in with a safety belt and think slowly and carefully as to how all of this is going to work. Now, all of this, you know, can be written down with algebraic symbols, and you can solve and compute and do all of that good stuff. But
John, before
yes.
you go any further, there are two questions.
Right.
One from Paul Heidus, which says, probably obvious, but wouldn't you think that demand has an intertemporal component that depends on price expectations? What car to buy, technology to use? You seem to abstract thereof. Is that because these are quantitatively unimportant?
And the answer is, yeah, so let me deal with that first. You know, I agree with like cars and things like that. It's worth noting that oil, about 70% of oil production is used in transportation. We abstract away from that part of dynamics. In large part, we're thinking about a very upstream part of this market, but we have enough problems, so we're going to run through as if that's not first order. That may be wrong, and I would be particularly worried if I was doing this exercise sort of starting today over the next 40 years, because one wonders whether the introduction of electric cars would be significant in this regard. So, you know, that's certainly something to keep in mind, and just it sits outside our framework. But I suspect particularly over the next 20 years will be important and be something that OPEC and others are thinking about. Sorry, there was a second question?
Yes, this is by David Chenesov, and he's asking, analogous to consumer welfare contribution of the highest demanders, isn't there a part of e.g. Saudi Arabian production whose costs you can never recover as those fields are never put into play? Do the dynamics somehow help you there? Or do you need engineering understanding of the technology to accomplish a full accounting of the cross-firm inefficiency, that is productive inefficiency?
Yeah. No, David's hit on an important data issue. In the earlier paper in the AER, we only used fields that actually had produced to get around the issue that is pointed at there. Saudi Arabia has a lot of fields which they haven't tapped yet. So in the first paper, we abstract away from, we don't think about the impact of those guys. So that makes our estimates conservative. Given they're still massive, we're pretty comfortable with that. In the second paper, we take a more aggressive approach and do rely on engineering estimates. And the reason for that is that, you know, to do particularly deadweight loss, we need to have some view as to what the industry believes the costs and consequent value of those fields might be in thinking about hoteling rents and so on. I think it's the lesser of two evils, but it's, you know, as a result of this and other aspects of the dynamics, there's a lot of robustness that you want to do when you're computing the welfare objects of interest unambiguously. And, you know, what we find is that the sort of qualitative stuff is pretty robust, you know, unsurprisingly perhaps. But, you know, that's, once you unpack the data, where we're going to use those engineering estimates for untapped resources because they're the best data on those things we can find. Thank you for those questions.
Thank you.
Let me reiterate what we're going to measure. We're going to measure total gains from trade, which is the difference between the discounted gains from trade in the relevant counterfactual and in reality. We're going to then decompose that. The first step in that decomposition is going to be working out productive inefficiency. And that's going to be the difference, you know, given observed production, it's the difference between the cost of producing that in reality and the cost of producing that amount in a counterfactual where production is being determined by a social planner. And then total gains from trade minus productive inefficiency, the residual is what we're going to call deadweight loss. You know, it's a slightly non-traditional approach to thinking about the accounting, but in the dynamics, it's a very helpful way to conceptualize it. So let me move now from theory to just pure measurement issues. We have to make a bunch of decisions on how we're going to do this. because of the practicalities of the data. Let me just sort of flag a few of these. First, we need to bake in a discount rate, and we're going to use 0.95 for no reason other than this is a pretty common thing to use in economic modeling. So, you know, we're sort of scaled relative to a lot of the literature. We're also going to put in physical limits on how much oil can be extracted at once from any field. Our understanding of the geophysics of oil extraction is that you can't simply suck everything out in one go. To do with, and the issues are to effectively extract oil, you need to maintain gas pressures and things like that. There's some other things that we do in the model, but in the interest of time, I want to get to actual results. So let me move forward. We also do some estimation, none of which is interesting econometrically. We estimate demand using P's and Q's and an instrument from the cost data, and we estimate costs at the field level, essentially to get rid of some measurement error. Here's where I want to spend time. This is the result that comes out of putting the data and in their estimated sense through the model that I've just described to you at a fairly high level, and then get discounted welfare objects. So let me walk through this table of 9 numbers from top to bottom. So remember, this is going to give you the impact of OPEC from 1970 to 2014 in billions of 2014 dollars. So starting from the very top, if we ignore the fact there could be multiple distortions going on in this market and just lump everything together, the total loss gains from trade is going to be 6.2 trillion over the course of this amount of time. So if we then try to decompose that into the inframarginal and marginal, if I begin with inframarginal, remember this is in the absence of any other distortion, what's the loss gains from trade that can be attributed to market power? So the way we do this is we say, let's hold OPEC's production constant and let the production of the fringe be dictated by a social planner, right? And look at the difference between the gains from trade generated from that versus the gains from trade generated in reality. That which we can attribute to market power is roughly 10% of the total loss gains from trade, 764 billion. By contrast, if we take the marginal approach, so remember this is, let's take the rest of the world's distortions as given and just work out what happens if you put cartel behavior on top of that. And let me say that the way this is done is by holding the rest of the world's production constant and then allowing the social planner to operate OPEC. And taking the difference between that and reality, let me say that's a provable lower bound to the object of interest, right? So there's a bounds approach being done there in the background in terms of the theory. But if we take that number as an indication of the marginal impact, it's 5.7 trillion, which is a little over 90% of it's a little over 95% of the total loss gains from trade. Now, what's fascinating about this is the difference between the magnitudes inferred from these two approaches. The impact of OPEC is relatively small, and that's because in that measurement frame, what you're going to do is allow the rest of the world to be very efficient. Conversely, if you stack OPEC on top of all the other messiness in the world in your welfare calculation, you find that OPEC has a massive impact. And so what do you learn from this? Well, another way to say that is, how do you reconcile all of this? And, you know, it's sort of intuitive from an interesting, you know, in an IO lens. It means that much of what's supporting the impact of OPEC is the fact that the rest of the world does a very poor job at responding and mitigating to the distortions imposed by OPEC. In some sense, entry doesn't happen fast enough. Changes in production patterns in the rest of the world when OPEC does something different isn't as responsive as we would like it to be, which begs the question, you know, what are these distortions that are screwing up that response? You know, taxation is one that I've talked about already, which is a big deal in this industry. Also, the kind of adjustment costs that we're familiar with thinking about in dynamic models, particularly in productivity settings, I suspect are a big deal. To actually get oil out of a country and, say, export it, which is what would have to happen for, say, Mexico, if OPEC pulls back on production. Mexico is a bad example. I want to use Brazil. You need to have, say, port infrastructure and you know, actual ships that can do it. You need pipelines. You know, there's a lot of capital costs. So if you think of the sort of the some of the dynamic industry models by, you know, Pindyke and others that try to get at this stuff, you start to see that these adjustment costs can have a long run effect, even though that they're short run costs. So, you know, the point that I want to leave you with is the estimates here suggest that a large part of what is supporting OPEC is, you know, inefficiencies that arise from other stuff in the rest of the world. You know, there's the old idea from Robert Bork that, you know, entry should mitigate everything. It just takes a hell of a lot of time. Is you know, we see the shadow of that in these numbers. You know, what's also striking, let me say, is that whether you believe the smaller number or the bigger number, you know, we're measuring welfare impacts due to cartel activity in the billions, if not the trillions. And that, for me at least, is enough to give me confidence to, you know, go to my macro colleagues or, you know, say in other settings that unambiguously, even on classical welfare metrics, cartelization can have a first order effect. Somewhat interestingly, the basic pattern is that most of the effect is in terms of deadweight loss, although productivity, productive inefficiency is still a big deal and has a quantum that's in the hundreds of billions of dollars over this period. Let me spend the last 2 minutes showing...
John?
Yes.
Sorry, there's a question from Patrick Rey asking whether in this setup it would be possible to account for carbon emissions as part of the welfare effect, I guess.
That's something where... No, I think that's fascinating. That's something where we've been debating, you know, in various iterations of this project for about 5 years. The short answer is yes. The tougher answer is, how would you do it? Mm-hmm. I desperately want to put something like that into the paper, in part to make the controversial point that OPEC is, in some sense, imposing the very carbon tax that we would like to impose. The objection we might have is that they're also collecting the revenue from it. I think the way you do it is you work out what the equivalent tax would be to generate the same loss gains from trade. And that would give you a size of the equivalent equivalent tax that's being imposed, it would be pretty big. If you just eyeball the difference between, say, Saudi Arabia's production cost and the world price, we're looking at a $50 a barrel roughly tax, which is roughly the same as what you see in the environmental literature as to what an appropriate carbon tax would be. So in the back of my head, what I think of is if you didn't have OPEC, you would have to double the carbon tax, which is startling. It's possible to do this calculation on a year-by-year basis by slightly reframing the thought experiment. If you do such a thing, is highest in those instances where, historically we've thought about OPEC as having a big impact. So in the early 80s, OPEC was really quite effective. Stunningly not effective in the late 90s, which lines up with the historical record. OPEC kind of screwed up their production decisions around the Asia crisis in 98 and actually produced too much and pushed the oil price lower than anyone thought it should go. And then they got their act together in part in cooperation with Norway immediately afterwards, and then instituted a more effective quota system in the early 2000s. The period around the Asia crisis in 1998 has, feels very similar to the spat between Saudi Arabia and Russia in the last 12 months. So let me conclude. The sort of thoughts that I want to leave you with, I think, are that, welfare accounting in the presence of cartels and market power generally is worth thinking about, and is complicated by the presence of other distortions, and is data intensive. And there's a real role here for theory and measurement to work in tandem to kind of get this right. So there's it's a joint effort by those who are more theoretically inclined and those who are more inclined towards measurement to continue to think through carefully how we do all of this. One of the implications for me is that it's worth thinking carefully about how we use non-traditional data sources like accounting data, which typically we're very, very skeptical of. I think somewhat unfairly, because if nothing else, it's very clear that managers who are making decisions about the firms we're interested in are using that data to inform their decisions. So for better or worse, there's information in those data that inform actual observed behavior. So thinking about robust, or at least not insane, ways to use that data is quite a, I think, important thing to do moving forward. In productivity estimation, I think they've thought about this quite a bit and quite productively, but we can leverage it in other settings as well. And let me reiterate, I think theory is very helpful for organizing how to do this, and at least being clear as to the assumptions you're taking on board when you do use it. With respect to cartel policy specifically, one of the things that is clear when you think about this project, both in the theoretical frame and the measurement, is that as there's more variance amongst firms in an industry in terms of their costs, all else equal, the cartel harm is going to be higher because it's going to result in greater productive inefficiency. And that, for me at least, was a new insight. The other thing that's interesting is that there's evidence here that the cartel is being sustained by distortions that are unrelated to the actual cartel activity. And this makes me wonder whether competition agencies could productively think about advocating more broadly within government to get rid of some of the distortions that occur due to other governmental activity that plausibly have a real impact on the sustainability of cartels. In thinking about the existing competition tool in the UK and the one that's under discussion in the EU, this may be a very interesting way to deploy those, really quite powerful tools, in terms of reorganizing industries a little bit and, getting rid of the stupid that may in turn facilitate cartel activity. And lastly, let me leave you with the sort of the takeaway that, this is a helpful instance where, in contrast to, some of the literature that says it's hard to see if cartels matter much, here we have welfare costs arising from a cartel that measure in the multiple trillions, which, gives us some comfort that the things we're interested in are also things that are stunningly important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. I think that your camera is about to be on again. I cannot see any more questions in the Q&A box, but I have one for you myself, which is the following. As you know, in resource economics, there is a long tradition and an enormous literature about the use of the original Hotelling model dating back to 1931,
Absolutely.
which now encompasses the case you are discussing in your paper, that is the analysis of a cartel with a fringe, or sometimes a cartel without a fringe. But still, in resource economics, as well as in some part of environmental economics, the welfare analysis comes a bit in the background because the matter is the resource preservation. So things like a cartel may ensure a longer life for exhaustibles or any other resources than competition, than perfect competition in particular, because of the lower pressure onto the resource, because the cartel is maximizing profits while the others are not, and so on and so forth. And the question is, do you think that your approach could be nested into the latest generation of the Hotelling models in order to merge our analysis in IO with theirs in resource economics, in order to make the problem one for both on both sides? Because at the moment, the overlapping between what we do in IO and what they do, say me, on my part, I'm quite hybrid at the moment, but I understand that our perception of the problem is not exactly the same, and there is a persistent problem with the evaluation of welfare, of economic welfare, encompassing, by the way, with reference to Patrick's question before, emissions and the environmental damage, in connection with the usual stuff, which means competition versus cartel behavior for the oil market, for instance. So shall we have at some point a common approach to this story, encompassing all you have done in these papers, translated into their languages?
I think so. It's certainly true that the framework that we're putting together is nests very much in the Hotelling tradition that you point at. I think that the bit that's interesting to think about in this regard, and I do think it's possible, is working out, how to set up a social planner that incorporates both the kind of welfare objects that I've been talking about, which are the very classical price theoretical ones, with a broader objective function, right? So it's really, I think about your question as, can we put different social welfare functions into this? Right. So, I would be optimistic and say yes, but because, I think there's probably going to be some practical, work to be done. Sure. Largely in implementation, like, the computational burden of doing this stuff is non-trivial, 66,000 fields and so working out how to make it efficient and feasible is part of the challenge. And that's, I think that would be quite interesting. I suspect oil is not the right resource to think about this. If you think about Elinor Ostrom's work about, other more renewable resources and how, cooperative behavior sustains those in fisheries and other things like that, that would be a much more interesting place to do it, I suspect.
Yeah. Thank you, John. I don't see any more questions in the box. So we are just in time. The time is approaching. I have just a few seconds to thank John Asker again very much for being with us today and for delivering this wonderful plenary for the third day of EARIE 2020. I thank again our global sponsor and all the attendees, and I invite all of you to rejoin the conference online in about 15 minutes from now for the last round of invited papers in 2 very, very appealing sessions. Thank you very much, and see you later after a short break. Thank you.